Here's how Jesus continues in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, beginning at verse 38. He says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you." I'm going to begin our study this morning with a question, and the question is this: have you ever been around a wounded animal? Have you ever been around a wounded animal? I remember a few times growing up, whether it was a bird or an opossum or even a dog that was, in our yard or in the neighborhood or something like that, and we kids would find an animal that was hurt, and we'd go tell mom and dad and say, "Hey, guess what? There's this animal that's out there hurt," and always, without fail, no matter what kind of animal it was, the advice was the same, right? Stay away, right? Just stay away from it. Because that's how animals are, right? Instinctively, as soon as they are wounded, they will attack you. They will lash out. So even if you have good intentions, even if your heart is to say, I want to nurse this bird back to health, I want to make sure that this animal's protected, isn't going to get run over in the street, I want to move it to the side or something like that. Even if you have good intentions for this animal, it will lash out at you, it will attack you, it will harm you, because instead of seeing you as someone that can help it, it sees you as a threat. So stay out of its way. Friends, sometimes, even as Christians, we can be like a wounded animal. Sometimes when we've been hurt, instead of seeing people around us as willing to help, as people who are going to make things better, we simply lash out. We experience the pain that we have, and we act like animals and just attack them because they happen to be there. We're going to talk about times when we've been hurt and see how Jesus wants us to respond. Spoiler alert, it's not as wounded animals, okay? That's not the way that Jesus wants us to behave. How do we do that as people in the kingdom, as people who are followers of Jesus? What we see this morning in verse 38 is what we've seen in previous texts and previous passages before this. He speaks first about the past, and it's the same formula that he's used before. You have heard that it was said. This is different than when Jesus quotes Scripture, because when he quotes Scripture, he says it is written, but here he doesn't say it is written, but instead he says, you have heard that it was said. And so here Jesus, again, is talking about the interpretation of the law, the application of the law, rather than the law itself. And Jesus quotes this great law. He says, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. And before we get to how Jesus kind of reinterprets the law and says how we need to apply that in our lives as Christians, we need to understand something about it first, and that's this. This law was given to encourage mercy. You might be thinking, well, this doesn't sound like a very merciful law. It sounds like it's just. In fact, it might even sound like it's over the top, because you know that popping someone else's eye out or popping a tooth out of their mouth isn't going to give you your tooth or your eyeball back. It's not going to help anything to pop their eyeball out and pop their tooth out. Well, just take a step back and think about this. Imagine if you stole a candy bar from Walgreens. Right? You go to pick up your prescription, and while you're there, you see a Snickers bar, and you're feeling hungry. And so you grab that Snickers bar, and you just walk out with it. Now, if you were caught stealing that candy bar, what happens? Do they say, well, the full retail price of that candy bar is 79 cents, so if you give us 79 cents, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, then we'll be even, because you just, that's what it costs. And so there's no record, so there's no wrong, so there's no police involvement, there's no kind of fine or punitive, there's nothing like that, just 79 cents and you're scot-free. No, that's not how it works, right? Justice demands that they need to be repaid even more than what they took. And you can see that on a larger level, too, that if someone takes my car, they don't say, well, okay, now you owe him a few $1,000s because that's what it was worth. They say, no, this was grand theft auto, right? This is a felony, and this is going to be on your record forever, and you're going to serve some jail time and all this. It's not just whatever the worth of the car was is what you have to pay back. And the ancient societies were no different. If someone harms you, you're allowed to harm them along with a little extra to make sure they never do it again. Give them a little vengeance. Show them that they messed with the wrong person. But not so with God's people, even with Old Testament Israel. Mercifully, their law was an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Side note, this has nothing to do with the sermon, but boy, till I got this tooth pulled, I never realized, how significant this is, tooth for a tooth, right? That just 1-to-1. It's kind of crazy to think about. But God's people, you see, were different, right? They weren't like the societies around them where they said, okay, you need to make this person suffer. You need to retaliate. You need to make sure that this person knows they messed with the wrong person, right? They had a reputation, God's people did, for being rescued from the Egyptians. They had a reputation for being delivered through the Red Sea. They had a reputation for God providing for them in the wilderness wanderings. They had a reputation for God providing military might for them as they took over the promised land, right? Over and over and over again, God's people get rescued from the mess that they've gotten themselves into. And God shows himself to be merciful because it's not that God's people ever earned any of these good things. It's not that God said, well, these Jewish people are really wonderful people and they seem really nice, and so therefore I'm going to make sure that I always rescue them. No, God loved them and said, because I love you, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to care for you. I'm going to give you everything that you need. Society around them knew about what God had done for them. And this little law, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, made sure that God's people showed mercy even in their courts as well. They experienced God's mercy so much, they limited how much payback was going to take place. Because God didn't treat them as their sins deserved. They didn't treat others as their sins deserved. Absolutely amazing. But Jesus doesn't even leave that merciful law as it is. He takes it a step further. I say to you, do not resist the one who's evil. Does this mean that we as Christians allow evil to go unchecked, that we're to be spineless, that we're to let people walk all over us? No. In fact, the Bible teaches that we speak out against injustice. You remember the way that early Christians were given that great commission to go and tell the whole world, all the nations, about who Jesus was. And as soon as they started to do that, the government said to them, hey, we don't want you doing this. You're throwing the whole world upside down. Well, why would you do this? Guys, we're going to throw you in jail if you keep doing this. And they said, no, we're not going to listen to you. We're going to listen to Jesus. He is our Lord, and we're going to do what he says to do. So it would be unjust for us to just keep our mouths shut or to sit in jail because of the gospel that God has given us. We're going to still do this. We're going to speak out against the injustice of being told to stop. Remember that Paul, when he was arrested, that he himself appealed to Caesar, and he says, I'm a Roman citizen. You're not giving me the rights that I deserve. He was being withheld of the rights that he had as a Roman citizen, and so he appeals to Caesar. He appeals to the highest level to say, I want justice. Right? Christians don't get walked over. Christians aren't spineless. You remember why the deacons in the early church were appointed to do their work? There were widows in the early church. And the church knew, like we saw last week, that women in society didn't have any way to provide for themselves 2,000 years ago. And so the church said, well, we're going to do whatever it takes to make sure that widows are provided for. We're going to make sure that we show the love of God to them, that they're provided for and protected and have everything that they need, right? So there was this perception going on that it seems like the Jewish widows are being better taken care of than the Gentile widows. Guys, this doesn't seem right. It looks like there's favoritism going on here. So the early church said, you know what, let's make sure that we have deacons that make sure that there's good benevolence for all people, that it's not one group getting more than another. And lo and behold, the majority of the deacons had Gentile names. They made sure that those Gentile widows were provided for. It wasn't like they were getting the short straw. Right? There's justice for Christians. Men like William Wilberforce and others were strong Christians who fought out against slavery, and eventually it was abolished in England because of their Christian principles. Abraham Lincoln in our own country credits his Christian faith, his desire to see people being valued for their self-worth, because all people are people no matter what skin color they have, no matter what status they have in life. It made him speak out against the injustice of slavery. It's why myself and other members of our church have marched through Roseland over the gun violence that's taken place there, over the senseless killings that have torn apart that neighborhood. We've marched and said, no more guns, no more violence. Right? It's not opposed to the Second Amendment. It's opposed to the kind of behavior that people have where they senselessly take other people's lives. And as Christians, we're called to speak out against that, to have this sense of justice. It's why we stand along Ridge Road in the next few weeks and speak out about the value of human life, even those who are unborn. We have a chain of life to remind everyone who drives by to say, hey, every life is valuable. It's unjust that these little ones who have no voice, who have no one to protect them, it's unjust that their lives are being taken senselessly. These are all justice issues. Don't let anyone tell you that justice doesn't matter to Christians. They all matter. Well, then what's going on in our passage? If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. What does that mean? We have to know a little bit about culture to understand this one. Jesus is not speaking out against self-defense. He's not speaking out about guarding your own life. He says the word slap for a reason. He didn't say punch or shoot or something intended to really injure. In those days, the only hand that someone would use to strike someone else would be their right hand. Okay? So I want you to imagine if someone is standing in front of me, facing me. Jesus says, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, right? Imagine that this person's back is to you and you see them standing in front of me, right? Use your imagination. There's someone standing here right in front of me, and Jesus says, if someone slaps you on your right cheek, some of you are visual people, how could someone with their right hand slap someone across from them on the right cheek? Say it. Backhanded. Right? If someone slaps you on your right cheek, they're going like this to you. You know what that speaks about? It speaks about disrespect. There's still a term today for that kind of action that takes place when someone hits someone across the face like that. It's called a backhand slap, right? Totally disrespectful to the person who's getting hit. And even in that society, in that day, masters would do that to slaves. They'd hit them across the face with their backhand to show, I'm a person in power, you're a person of lower status, you're someone who doesn't even deserve to be hit with my open hand, you get to be hit with my backhand. That's how valuable, how lack of value you have as a person. And so what does Jesus say? If someone slaps you in the right cheek, he says, offer them the other cheek as well. You know what Jesus is saying? This is incredible. What Jesus is saying is, if they hit you this way, and you get slapped in the right cheek with a backhand, you know what Jesus says? Go like this to them. You want to hit me? Hit me on this side. Hit me as someone who has your respect. Hit me as someone that you see, someone who has dignity and worth and value. I'm not someone of lower status and lower society, but I'm valuable. I have inherent worth. That's what Jesus is telling Christians to do in response. Turning the other cheek demands dignity. means I don't want to be treated this way anymore. I'm someone of value, someone of worth, someone who shouldn't be treated like garbage. If you're going to strike me, hit me on the left cheek, the kind of blow that shows that we're equals. And this is a courageous move. It tells people they can't hurt us like this anymore. They can't just get away with doing whatever they want. But it also keeps us in check. Jesus doesn't say, give them a backhanded slap back. Lower them to that level. Show them that you're the one in power and they're the ones who are down and have nothing. Show them that they're worthless to you. No, that's not what Jesus says. Instead of going down to their level, bring them up, make sure that they bring you up to yours. Friends, I don't often talk about politics. This is right over the heart of the plate. Like you can't not see this when you're hearing the way that politics goes. And I'm not going to speak against one person or the other, but let me just say this. Our political discourse has gotten so broken and so messed up that everyone sees the other person as the devil and the worst thing ever. And all I see constantly is politicians just trying to bring the other person down, trying to backhand slap them. Look how worthless this person is. Look how this person has no dignity and no value and shouldn't be given the time of day. And so I'm going to leave it at that. But let me say, too, there was a time politically where in our country, people who disagreed with each other could talk with each other. They could have discussions, and it was civil. And unfortunately, instead of the civil conversations that take place in society, politicians looking like that, I think our society has kind of taken a cue from them. And we've started to write people off and started to act that way when we disagree with someone. So I'll just leave it at that. But that's not the kind of way that Christians are supposed to live. Jesus continues, and he says that when we're hurt, we appeal to the conscience of other people. And again, there's more culture and history here in these two verses. In a court, people could sue for an outstanding debt, and they could legally take a person's tunic. There's law that said that it was okay to take someone's tunic. But even the poorest of the poor person was allowed to keep their cloak for a couple reasons. First, because it was probably the most valuable thing that a person owned. But second, it was the kind of thing that gave a person life. For the poorest of poor person, even if their tunic was taken from them, they still had their cloak. The weather we're experiencing right now is the kind of weather that happens year-round in Israel because of the elevation. And the warm days and cool nights were a normal thing for them. But it's not just cool nights. It's not just like 65-degree nights. It's cold nights. And so people during the day would be plenty warm. It's kind of this arid tropical or desert kind of region. And then during the evening times, it got so cold because of the elevation that people would just shiver at night. And so they would have their cloak in order to have a blanket wrap around them. They were so poor that they were homeless. This was the one source of protection and shelter in a person's life. And Jesus says, if someone takes you to court and they win your tunic, give them your cloak too. Because if you're so poor that they literally are going to take the shirt off your back, give them your cloak too. Give them your coat. Show them that if they think you're so worthless that you're willing to take the shirt off your back, give them your coat too. Because when you do, that person's going to be ashamed of himself. He's going to say, how could I take this poor person's shirt and now take their cloak too? This is the one thing that keeps them alive. And Jesus says, give them that too. Maybe they'll realize, maybe I want this person to live rather than take everything that they have. Jesus says, if someone forces you to go a mile, go a second mile. This area was occupied by Roman forces during this time. Imagine Imagine here in the States, if we had soldiers from another country, different flag on their shoulder with guns and boots and all the rest, and constantly patrolling our streets, making sure that we were meeting curfew, making sure that we were doing just what we were supposed to do. Imagine if we were occupied by a foreign country and had these soldiers who were here. And imagine if they decided, you Americans, you people who live in America, the way that you are, you're so worthless that I'm going to make you carry my heavy equipment. I'm going to make you carry my stuff. And 2,000 years ago, that's what would happen in this society, that the people were forced to carry the soldiers' equipment for an entire mile. There's a law that said the soldiers could only have them carry the equipment for 1 mile. If it went over a mile, it broke military code. It was wrong for them to do. So Jesus says, if someone tells you to walk for a mile with their stuff, walk another mile with their stuff. What's happening here is Jesus is having these people who are feeling oppressed, who are down, whose country is occupied, he's having them do something about it. And it's not, burn down the soldiers' barracks. It's not, set off IEDs next to the road, but instead it's carry their equipment another extra mile. What would that do? For one thing, it'd probably get the soldier in trouble, and it would get his attention. But even more importantly, it would help the soldier to see, maybe these people aren't my personal mule. Maybe I shouldn't just use them as a way to transport my stuff, but they're actually people. They have inherent value. What Jesus is asking is that these people would prick the conscience of the soldiers. Help them see that you're more than just a transport device. Maybe if they get in trouble, it'll help them notice. Now, this last verse of the text is kind of confusing at first. Jesus says, "Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you." Jesus here is talking about benevolence, how to care for those in need. Give to the one who begs from you. Do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Why would that be here? Right? What does that have to do with eye for an eye? What does that have to do with walking the extra mile? What does that have to do with giving your cloak as well? Let's think about Jesus' words. On the surface, it sounds like a really bad policy for our deacons to enact as far as benevolence, right? Anyone asks you, just give it to them, right? I don't think that that's going to be a good model for mercy ministry. In fact, that's not what we should do. Does Jesus say that we should give whatever anyone asks for, no matter what, no questions asked? No, that's not what Jesus says here. He says, give to the one who begs from you. Not necessarily what they ask for, but give. And that's important. Sometimes when people are on the street and they're begging, someone's begging. When they're begging, they might be begging for money, but you might realize, what, if I give them $10 or $20, all I'm doing is enabling them. All I'm doing is keeping them in this downward spiral and not really helping them out at all. Sometimes helping hurts. There's a book with that same title. And you realize that and you say, well, Jesus didn't say give them whatever they ask for. He said give to those who beg. And sometimes our deacons themselves in the past have had to do this at times to say, we're not really helping a person by just giving them a blank check, by just bailing them out all the time. We're enabling them instead. So sometimes it means when someone says, can you give to me? Well, you give them good advice. You give them actual help. Sometimes it means like Love Inc., this ministry partnership that we have with regional churches around the area. It means that we're partnering with other churches that we give life skills classes to people who are in need. And we say, let's help them make sure that budgeting-wise, your funds are going in the right places, that you make sure that the big things like where you live and what you drive and what you eat are all covered before you buy the rest of the luxuries. Sometimes it means that when someone says, I'm hungry, can I have some money? You say, if you're hungry, I'd love to go down the street and buy you a meal. Let's sit and talk and have a meal together. I'd love to spend time with you. You give that person more than just food. You give them some worth. Don't refuse is the same idea. Sometimes it's translated, don't turn away. Right? If someone says, I'll pay you back. Yeah, right. You people never pay back. No, Jesus doesn't say that. Just don't refuse them. Don't turn away from them. But instead, help them. So take a step back. Eye for an eye, turn the cheek, give your cloak, walk the extra mile, help the needy. What are all these things about? An eye for an eye says, be measured, don't overdo punishment for the wrong person. Turn the other cheek says, help them see your inherent value, don't get looked down on. Give your cloak means make them think if they want to see you freeze to death. Walk the extra mile means you're a person, not a mule. Help the needy means that they need help right now. All these things talk about the inherent value of human life. Person who's done wrong to you is valuable enough that you don't go kill them because they did something wrong to you. I don't get angry, I get even. No, not in Jesus' kingdom. Right? Even if they've hurt you, they're still valuable. They're still made in the image of God. Someone who is oppressed, is looked down on, gets backhand slapped, they're valuable. Someone who's poor, is taken to court, might lose the one thing that protects their life, they're valuable. Someone whose country is occupied, valuable. Someone who's in need, valuable. And it all goes back to what we said at the beginning as far as God's Old Testament people. Remember, the whole point of this eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth is let the people around you see what God has done for you. Let them see that you've been rescued not because of what you've done. Let them see that you are valuable to God, so much so that He always takes care of you, always provides for you, doesn't look at who you are and what you've done, but instead looks at what Christ has done for you. And that's where we come to in this passage too. What if we as Christians actually did this and said, you know what, I don't want to get back at people. I want to help them see they've done is wrong so that they're restored. I want to prick people's conscience like Jesus encourages. I want to think about ways to put pressure on people so that they say, boy, every life is valuable. Whether it's unborn or whether it's from the Middle East, whether it's a refugee, whether it's a Muslim life, every life is valuable. What if we live like that because of what God has done for us? That's what Jesus is calling us to here. He doesn't say, get back at everyone who's ever done something wrong for you. No, what he's saying is what God has done and what we're called to do too. Do not treat them as their sins deserve. Show the same kind of grace and same kind of mercy that God Himself has shown you. You see, God's great grace transforms us too. It helps us constantly go back to the cross and constantly say, God, you have not treated me as I deserve. God, help me not to treat anyone else as they deserve to, but help me to do so much more. Help me to give just a little glimpse as far as what you've done for me. Let's pray together. Our Heavenly Father, once again, you've drawn us to the cross. Once again, you've drawn us to this place where we recognize your goodness and your grace and your mercy in our lives. Once again, we realize, God, it's not because of what we've done that you love us, but it's simply because of who you are. It's because of your great love for us. God, may you always receive the glory. May our lives, even especially when we've been hurt, when we're wounded, God, let people see you through that. Let us be just this beacon of light to a world that needs you now more than ever. And help us to just delight in and rejoice in the wonderful cross. God, this is our prayer in Jesus' name.